I want to bring in CNN senior legal analyst Preet Bharara. He's also a former U.S. attorney. Preet, what's your initial reaction to this bombshell news?
Well, in some ways, people were expecting that there might be charges against Michael Flynn. There's been speculation in the press and among, former prosecutor types for a lot of weeks that Flynn not only probably was going to be charged, but that he might plead guilty to those charges. I think in some ways, there's some surprise that the charges are so narrow, and it's just one count, a significant count, a serious count of lying to the FBI, which is something you should never do. But I think it highlights one very important thing that we've seen not only in this case, but also in the case of the cooperating witness, George Papadopoulos, and that is that the Mueller team takes very, very seriously the idea of lying and of obstruction. And I think we also know that the Mueller team still has a long way to go, as I think some of the commentators have been opining on the show so far before I came on. There are a lot of other witnesses to talk to. There are a lot of other shoes to drop. They're sort of, in some ways, just getting started. And, most sort of tellingly, there's a lot of lying going on, and they have to get to the bottom of why that lying was happening. What underlying activity were they trying to hide? I mean, this was a person who was a national security advisor to the President of the United States. And these lies that he pled guilty to, they're not allegations anymore, they're proven charges, occurred on the 4th day of the presidency of Donald Trump.
And what he was doing, conducting foreign policy before the Trump team had taken over, before the president had been inaugurated, a violation of the Logan Act, that's not an act that has been enforced quite often. In fact, I think only once before in the history of the United States. What might this all tell us, or what do you suspect it tells you about who he might be looking at next? Jared Kushner, who else?
Yeah, look, I think the Mueller team is looking at everyone. And you're exactly right. The Logan Act is sort of an obscure statute, I think passed in 1799. I don't think ever successfully used. But it's interesting for people to talk about and suggest the seriousness of some of the things that may have happened here. But I think the Mueller team is looking at every member of the campaign. I think they're looking at every member of the transition team. I think they're looking at everyone up to the President of the United States himself. I mean, when Michael Flynn, it's been reported today, has said that he's cooperating with the government, that means he must tell, if he's asked, everything he knows about the conduct of other people up to and including the President of the United States. And it's already been reported on your show and in other places that the senior transition official that directed him to make contact with the Russians was Jared Kushner. The next question is, well, who was Jared Kushner talking to? Was he talking to his father-in-law, who happens to be the president? Was some of this contact only after the election when there was a transition team, or did some of it happen during the campaign itself? That raises a whole other series of questions about whether or not the president, through Michael Flynn and others, was suggesting that they wanted the Russian government to do things with respect to the election, the thing that people understand Mueller to be looking at, interference with the American election, and then almost more seriously than that, whether or not in the campaign and afterwards, there were promises made or representations made on the part of the future Trump administration of what they would do for Russia in exchange for either, again, speculatively, help in the campaign, or less speculatively, an agreement not to press hard on sanctions and to vote a particular way on that UN resolution that dealt with Israel. Those are, I think, very, very important questions that remain unanswered.
All right, Preet Bharara, thank you so much.